Hello, everyone. Welcome back to class. Today, we're going to spend some time talking about sectionalism. We're going to wrap up this unit. This will be the last set of notes that you have for this unit. And basically, what we're going to do today is we're going to go over everything that we've already talked about in a brief, condensed version. So if you didn't pay attention in the last few videos, pay attention here. This information will be helpful. And it will help you through your next quiz in a very big way. Okay, so we're going to start off by talking about what is sectionalism. Now, sectionalism, we have it defined here as it refers to different lifestyles, social structures, customs, and political values of the North, South, and West. Eventually, what this turns into, because we have different political, economic, geographic, and social ideas in different parts of the country, it leads to people doing what's best for their section of the country. Okay, so if your section is in the north, and what's best for you is having factories and tariffs to support your businesses, that's what you support. And that leads to sectionalism, where in the South, those things don't necessarily help people in the South. Okay, so in the South, they're focused on farming. They're focused on agriculture, plantations. That's where they make their real money. Out west, when people move out west, there's abundant land. There's a ton of cheap land. There's also things like gold and other metals and ores that they could be mining for. So the idea of sectionalism, and I want you to write this down, is eventually it's doing what's best for your section of the country. If you need to pause it and write this down, sectionalism is doing what is best for your section of the country. Okay? Okay, so hopefully you got that written down. The next thing that we want to look at is the Missouri Compromise. Okay? The Missouri Compromise, this was a solution for these political, economic, and geographic differences for a while. It centered around the idea of slavery. When Missouri wanted to enter as a slave state, the government decided they needed to have another free state come in, and they drew that line, the 3630 line. This was a good solution for a while. Basically, from 1820 through 1850, it worked. But then along comes 1850 and trying to add new states like California, which is going to be a very large state. They have to do something a little bit different. So in 1850, let me move on to the next slide here. They need to make another compromise to meet the needs of all the people. Okay. So if you don't remember, there's 5 main parts. So if you need to pause the video and write down these 5 main parts, they're right here, 1 through 5. With the biggest one being the fugitive slave law. Okay, so before I get into that, I'm going to go ahead and let you pause and write down the fugitive, or these 5 things, and put a little star next to the fugitive slave law. Okay, so hopefully you've got all those written down now. So the fugitive slave law, this is a huge thing because it impacts people in the North and the South. Now, the South is happy about this because that means that they're going to have their runaway slaves. They have a better chance of getting them back from the North if they escape to the North. The North, they really disagree with this because now they're being forced to be a part of slavery in some capacity. And this is where we see a lot of people start their abolition movement. And this is where they really get their drive from. They don't want to participate in slavery. They don't want to help catch runaway slaves. And what this leads to is more slaves or former slaves being sold back into slavery. And there's even sometimes where free blacks in the North, who were never slaves to begin with, are put into slavery by mistake or on purpose or whatever. And it just really makes the problem worse throughout the years. Now, keep in mind, a lot of things are happening all at the same time. This is these actions happening simultaneously is what's leading to this division in sectionalism. There's more and more division, more and more fighting, more and more disagreements. The next thing we see is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. With the Kansas-Nebraska Act, we see Stephen Douglas show up and really talk about popular sovereignty and how that's best for the people. And the Kansas-Nebraska Acts, basically what Stephen Douglas says is people should have the right to choose if they want slaves in their state or not. The idea of popular sovereignty here is what he's saying is the best thing. Of course, this is going to create more debate. This is going to cause more fighting in places like Kansas and Nebraska. We see the actions of people in Kansas from both sides, the anti-slavery movement and slave owners, pro-slavery movement, fighting in Kansas, which leads to what we call bleeding Kansas. This is the first time we see John Brown show up, and this is where he took it upon himself with him and his sons to go and fight these slave owners and even kill people over this. And we'll see later on, we'll talk about this here in just a couple minutes. Stephen Douglas is going to keep using this idea of popular sovereignty to push him further in the Senate seat. And even whenever he campaigns for presidency in 1860, he still talks about popular sovereignty. He's basically saying that people should have the right to choose on slavery, whether they're in the North or the South or wherever they are on the map. Okay. So if you need to pause this, go ahead and write down kind of the main points of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Stephen Douglas. That in popular sovereignty, go ahead and pause and do that now. Okay, let's move on. So all of these issues, the Fugitive Slave Act, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas, there's two sides to all of these. And basically, this is the wedge. Each one of these is a wedge that drives the North and the South further and further apart in their views. So there's more and more problems showing up. And then to kind of make things even worse, it gets taken to the federal level. So when we see the Dred Scott versus Sanford case in 1857, I'm trying to keep these chronological as best as I can. So I'm kind of bouncing back and forth between different people and different issues, but I'm trying to go chronologically as well. Okay, so in 1857, we have the Dred Scott versus Sanford case. If you watch the videos with this, you would know that Dred Scott was a former slave who was given freedom by his owner, and eventually he had been captured, and he was trying to sue for his freedom, and it made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And unfortunately for Dred Scott, the Chief Justice at the time, Roger Taney, some people call him Roger Taney. I think it's Roger Taney is how you're supposed to pronounce that. But Roger Taney, he came up with a couple of issues here. He said, one, slaves cannot sue for their freedom. They can't do anything in court because technically they're not even citizens. Therefore, they can't do anything. They're considered property. The other big part that came out of this, which was kind of a bombshell for everybody, was Roger Taney declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. So he kind of had the same kind of train of thought that Stephen Douglas had about popular sovereignty. And he said that the federal government is not allowed to make rules on slavery, no matter where they are on the map, without the consent of the people in those areas. So he basically said the Missouri Compromise is no more. It's unconstitutional. And from now on, popular sovereignty is going to decide the issue of slavery in these new states. Okay. So if you want to go ahead and pause this, get these main points written down about Dred Scott versus Sanford, and we'll come right back. All right, so the next part that we're going to talk about is the debates that Lincoln and Douglas had. The forefront issue is slavery and popular sovereignty. The big debate is, should we allow slavery? Should we let it expand? Should states have the right to choose? So Lincoln and Douglas, they challenged each other to a series of debates. Now, originally, Lincoln wanted to have dozens of debates. He wanted to have about 50 debates or 60 debates. I can't remember exactly. But they settled on 7 debates. And in these debates, they were talking about slavery. Is it morally right, morally wrong? Should people have the right to choose? Is popular sovereignty the way to go? Should the federal government make this decision? What's the idea here? And this whole time, they're debating for a Senate seat in Illinois. So as they are debating, Douglas is, of course, continuing with the idea of popular sovereignty. And Lincoln, he's debating for not letting it spread. He does not want slavery to spread out west. Now, we've got to keep in mind here, originally, the Republican Party, what they believed in was stopping the spread of slavery. Don't let it spread out west. Okay? They're not saying to get rid of slavery in the South. They are not saying that yet, because one main reason they're not saying that yet is they know if they start to say that out loud and they start to campaign for that, nobody in the South is going to vote for them when they get to the presidential level. Okay? And eventually it comes to a presidential race. Now, Lincoln ends up losing this Senate seat. Stephen Douglas wins the Senate seat in 1858. Now, when we get to 1860, which will be in a couple slides here, we will look at how they continued to debate the issue of slavery, and they both held the same idea of popular sovereignty versus not letting it spread. How involved should the government be, or the federal government be in this? And this is the Lincoln and Douglas debate. So if you need to pause, I'll go up one slide. If you need to write this down, I'll say pause here. And then if you need to pause here to write these down, feel free to do so. Okay, so we see these debates going on, and of course there's debate between these two candidates for Senate and eventually president. But there's also debates going on with the people, and there's more and more fighting. There's more and more uprisings, and there's revolts. So our next slide, we talk about the revolts. Sorry. Some of the main people we see in these revolts, we see Nat Turner, who led an uprising that ended up killing over 50 white people, slave owners and non-slave owners alike. And then in retaliation from that, we saw the families of those people go and kill slaves as a response to this. And these revolts happened throughout the years. So the 1830s, 1840s, especially in the 1850s and early 1860s, we see a lot of uprising, a lot of revolts. Another big revolt that we see is led by John Brown at Harper's Ferry. Eventually, John Brown is captured, and later he's given the death penalty. He's hanged for his crimes, or hung for his crimes. And these rebellions, unfortunately for the slaves, none of them are very successful. They're usually short-lived, not well organized, and there's no real end to slavery because of these revolts. There's just not much to them. Okay, so if you need to write something down about these revolts, go ahead and pause here and write that down. Okay, so that leads us to the election of 1860. Now, this presidential election is very big for the North and the South. Obviously, we know who wins. We know that Abraham Lincoln becomes president in 1860. But what makes the South so mad that they will actually secede and break away from the Union, is the fact that Stephen Douglas is really looked over by the Electoral College. Now, the popular vote was pretty close. Lincoln won by about 40%, with 40% of the popular vote, and Douglas had about 30% of the popular vote. But where it really makes a big difference is the electoral votes. So Lincoln had 180 electoral votes, and Douglas only had 12. Now, they're debating the same issues of popular sovereignty, slavery, should slavery spread or not. And Lincoln, still at this point, is saying that slavery should not spread out west. However, we're not going to get rid of it in the South yet. Okay. Now, the South, they don't trust Lincoln. They feel like Lincoln may not be telling the truth, which we'll find out later. But really what they're really angry about is the fact that they're being overlooked, and they feel like they're not being treated fairly. And they are basically being betrayed by the Constitution and how the votes aren't being upheld the way they should be upheld. So they break away. And South Carolina is the first state to break away. Now, in South Carolina, when they break away, they create the Confederate States of America. Now, South Carolina was the first one to leave. After they left, within just a couple of months, 6 other states left, for a total of 7 states that joined the Confederacy. Now, um, Jefferson Davis, he was the president of the Confederacy. And during his inaugural address, he talked about how the Declaration of Independence gave people the right to abolish a government that was not working for the people. And his justification for the South breaking away was more of the fact that they were forced to break away. They were forced to create the Confederacy. They didn't want to do this, they had to. This is very different from Lincoln's inauguration speech, his first inaugural speech. So if you want to pause here and take a look at or write down the things about the Confederate States of America, I'll pause here for a moment. If you want to write these down, and then I'll pause here for a moment. If you want to write these down, and then come back when you're ready to move on from there. Now, in Davis's speech, he talks about how he was forced to do this, how the South was forced to break away. This is very different from Lincoln's speech. Now, Lincoln, when he is elected president in 1860, he never really officially recognizes that the South had broke away. In fact, he talks about in his inauguration speech, just weeks after the Confederacy was formed, that the Union was perpetual. Basically, it goes on forever and ever. There's nothing that can dissolve the Union. And what he promises to do is to do his best to keep the Union together. Now, unfortunately, this leads to war, the Civil War, and there's going to be fighting. And the issue of slavery is at the forefront. I always have students ask, well, is it about slavery or is it about states' rights? And that debate, it's a valid debate. However, if it weren't for slavery, would the South really be pushing for those states' rights? Would they really be pushing for the idea of governing themselves if slavery was not in the picture? And that is a debate that could go on for months or years. In fact, it has gone on for years and centuries at that. Now, the way this war begins, and I'll go ahead and pause so you can write this down if you need to. So after Lincoln is elected, there are some more situations going on between the North and the South. One of the main ones being the battle at Fort Sumter. Now, initially, Lincoln's idea was to send supplies and reinforcement down to Fort Sumter, which is in South Carolina, okay, which is now in Confederate territory. So the Confederate states feel like that is now their fort. It belongs to them. There just so happens to be federal soldiers in there from the Union. So when the Union sends this ship full of supplies to Fort Sumter, Confederate forces fire upon this ship, and they start to fire upon the fort, and there is a battle. Now, this battle is unique because nobody dies in this battle. There are no casualties in the day of the battle. However, what this does do is it signals the beginning of the Civil War. This is the first official battle of the Civil War. This is a defining moment for our country. This is where we start to fight against one another. This is brother fighting brother. The battle is in April of 1861. After this battle is over, and this is a Confederate victory because the Union has to put up the white flag. They surrender. Eventually, those Union troops are removed from the fort and sent back to the North. In this transaction, there is one person who is injured who eventually dies, but it is a result of this battle. But it didn't that death did not take place during the battle, so we still kind of count that as a casualty after the battle. So April 16th, 1861 is where the Civil War begins. This war lasts for about 4 years. Our next unit, we will be talking about the Civil War and the details of it, some of the major battles, some of the major people, what Lincoln decided to do while he was in office, and even some of the decisions he made to where he didn't do anything. So inaction and action both have consequences. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. I hope you have a fresh look at sectionalism, and we can start the Civil War with a new face. And I hope y'all have a great day. Enjoy your time at home. And please don't forget to wash your hands. Have a great day. Bye bye.